Oh, hello. I didn't see you come in. Welcome, traveller, to Survive the Dive, a special Halloween edition. What is Halloween, you might ask? And are its roots in our pagan past? All shall be revealed.
A very sad, sorry, spooky-looking jack-o'-lantern.
Sad.
Sorry. Spooky.
On the 13th of May, 610 AD, Pope Boniface IV consecrated the Pantheon in Rome to the Blessed Virgin and all the martyrs, essentially making it sacred to all the saints, and ordered an anniversary of this day. From that day forth it was known as All Saints' Day. It is no coincidence that this All Saints' Day coincided with a pagan Roman festival. The Feast of Lemuria was a day on which Romans exorcised the ghosts of the dead from their homes. The restless spirits of the dead were known as Lemures, and they were appeased with offerings of beans and other things, including a sacred flour cake which was offered by the priests, and it was made from the first ears of wheat of the season. By placing this Christian feast on the same day as the former pagan feast, the Romans could be sure that this would get rid of any residual pagan practices that might be occurring among the Roman population. However, isn't it interesting that we notice that this celebration of the Romans was associated with the dead and also with the crops, with the cycles of the annual harvests. This is important to remember because 100 years or so later, Pope Gregory III moved the date of All Saints to its current date, the end of October, the beginning of November. And that is interesting because he must have had a reason similar to that of Boniface. And it has been noted by everyone today that the Halloween coincides with the pagan Celtic festival of Ireland, Samhain. So perhaps you could imagine that the Pope Gregory was intending, therefore, to move it on this day to prevent pagan practices among the Irish. That seems reasonable, except for there's a problem with that theory. Firstly, the Irish had been nominally Christian at least for a very long time by that point. And secondly, they didn't change their date of observance with Pope Gregory's decree. In fact, they continued to celebrate All Saints' Day in May, and they also continued to celebrate Samhain at the junction of October and November. Samhain was perhaps not a fully pagan festival among the Christian Irish by that time, but it certainly had some pagan connotations. Samhain is attested in the Celtic lunar calendar dating to the 2nd century after Christ. It was a turning point in the annual cycle, perhaps even marking the start of a new year. The 11th century Irish text, Din Shenhas, means the law of the places, and one of the places it names is called Maslecht, which means the plain of prostrations, and it says it had human sacrifices of the firstborn children, which were offered to Cromcruach, a god whose name means the Lord of the Hill, and that these sacrifices took place at Samhain. Similarly, a 17th century historian Geoffrey Keating wrote of sacred fires lit at Samhain on a hill in Meath, called Tlachta, where sacrifices were made to the gods. However, neither of these sources are considered reliable, and it seems more likely that Samhain was a feast of the dead, although there is no hard proof of this either. But in Irish legends, Samhain is a time of manifestations from the Cedar, which is the other world of supernatural entities such as fairies. The tradition of the jack-o'-lantern, called a punky in parts of Britain, was practiced around the British Isles, and may have originally represented the souls of the dead, since it was associated with will-o'-the-wisps, which pertained to the souls of the dead. Samhain was supposed to have been a special time when the boundary between the world of the living and the dead was more easily crossed, and this made it perfect for a day of remembrance of the dead. Over time, the Irish adopted the normal Catholic holidays, and Samhain was integrated with All Saints' Day and became the modern celebration known as Halloween, which was exported by immigrants to America, where it was popularized in the form we know of Halloween today. But then Halloween made another journey and came back to Europe, and many other places in Europe that are influenced by America started to celebrate Halloween in a similar way. Some people say that Halloween is therefore just an American celebration, a modern consumerist fest with no actual basis in European tradition. I argue that that is not the case. Why did Pope Gregory choose to move it to this date in the first place? Clearly, someone else in Europe besides the Celts, or someone nearer to the Romans, was still practicing some festival of the dead on that day. Let's look at some other Indo-European pagan traditions. We know that all Indo-European pagans worship specific feasts at specific times of the year, the most important of which were at the beginning of May, marking the start of the summer, the midsummer, the end of the harvest season, and the middle of winter. There were many others, of course, and these all vary slightly between cultures, but the four essential ones are always quite similar. And what I've noticed travelling around Europe is that some customs that you see observed in one country at midsummer are very like those that are observed in another country at May Day, or Halloween, or Yule. This to me suggests that these traditions were all interlinked and part of an annual cycle, and that as they have diffused recently across different parts of the Indo-European world, the traditions have survived in different ways in different parts of the year. Merely from looking at the Roman and Celtic examples I've already mentioned, it seems apparent that both the spring festival and the autumn festival, or the end of autumn festival, are the two most associated with the dead. However, there's plenty of evidence that the others may also have been associated with the dead. People say I don't mention the Slavs enough, so let's start with the Slavs. Among the pagan Slavs, there was a version of Halloween known as Dziady. It's still celebrated in different ways now in Slavic countries, and is thought to date back to pagan times. It is a day on which the Slavs commemorate their great ancestors, and the word itself means grandfathers. This can be interpreted as meaning ancestral fathers or clan fathers. It's very similar in that sense to the Anglo-Saxon celebration mentioned in Bede called the Night of the Mothers, which was celebrated in the middle of winter. And those mothers should be viewed as ancestral mothers, representative of a people, of a clan, of a tribe. And by celebrating those mothers, you celebrate your kins group, your kinship. The same thing with the Slavs, except they call it the grandfathers. And this diminutive name, referring to little grandmothers and little grandfathers, should not be seen literally as actual grandparents that they were worshipping, but distant ancestors, sometimes legendary or heroic. In Slavic countries on November 1st, you can see the graveyards are full of candles, and everyone goes to the graveyard to give candles firstly to their own relatives who are dead. And now there's also a tradition of putting candles on graves who no one else has put a candle on, so that every grave gets a candle. This is also very similar to stuff that happens in Scandinavia. Here in Sweden, you can see the same thing happening. This is a Christian custom associated with All Saints' Day, but it ties in with the pre-Christian traditions of this day of remembering the dead. Dziady was originally held sometimes 2 or even 3 times a year, but the principal times that it was traditionally practiced were at the beginning of spring, around what we call May Day in England or Valborg in Sweden, and then again at Halloween. During the feast of Dziady, the Slavs would perform libations. That's when you pour liquid offerings to the gods or to ancestors. They would also eat a ritual meal in celebration of their ancestors' souls who had joined the souls of the great clan grandfathers. Very similar practices occur among the Balts. In Latvia, for example, there is the festival of Martini. According to the solar tradition of the Baltic people, Martindiena marks the midpoint between the autumnal equinox, called Micheli, and winter solstice, Ziemesvetki. So it's celebrated on Halloween, sometimes in mid-November, a little bit afterwards. Martini is a celebration that marks the end of the period known as Velu Lex, the time of the dead. Even going back to the 18th century, there are reports on the folk traditions of the Baltic people describes the festival of Martini, and it's so similar to what we associate with modern Halloween. Children would get dressed up in masks and go around from door to door asking for gifts. It couldn't be any closer to trick-or-treating. The adults also dress in costumes and sometimes trying to scare the children. They would even wield belts of braided straw with which they would whip the children on the buttocks in order to scare them into behaving properly. Originally, the sacrifice of a rooster was a key event at Martini. I don't know if that's still practiced now in Latvia, but it is still the case that the rooster costume is a popular one. Sometimes the adults dress as rooster and sometimes the children dress as roosters. But what about the Germanic tradition? Modern neo-pagans often celebrate something called Alpha Blot, which is actually a historically attested blot that was practiced by Norse pagans, but we don't know when it was actually practiced. We know that the blot was definitely a celebration of the elves and that it was practiced at some point in the year. I think the decision of modern pagans to celebrate Alpha Blot on Halloween is actually correct. I'm not the first person to suggest that the elves may in fact represent ancestral clan fathers. There are many different supernatural beings in Germanic paganism, but only two types of beings can be used in the names of human beings. That's the gods and the elves. That means the elves must have been quite important, and also they must have had a positive connotation. For example, the English name Alfred means advised by elves. They're associated with Odin, but they're also associated with Frey. Frey is seen as the lord of Ljósafheim, and that means the land of the light elves. This association with Odin is clear from the following account in the skaldic poem Austurfaravisr. A man named Sigvatar is on a great journey across Sweden, and he comes to a homestead called Hof, which really kind of means a pagan temple. It probably represents Storehof in Västergötland. They expected to be received according to the laws of hospitality that were common among Germanic people and many other Indo-European people. But they were surprised to find all the doors would remain shut to them wherever they went, and that the locals were practicing something called Alpha Blot. These Christian travellers were rather annoyed. At the second farm he tried to get into, a woman told him to go away, and she said, "Don't go further inside, unlucky man. We here fear Odin's wrath. We are pagans." Then she chased him away and said that they were having an elven sacrifice. Well, why is it relevant that fearing Odin's wrath and a sacrifice of the elves? That isn't actually specified, but the woman makes it clear that not allowing Christians near to a sacrifice to the elves was somehow connected to Odin. There is another example of a sacrifice to the elves which wasn't at Alpha Blot in a different saga called Cormac Saga, and in that case it was done in order to heal a battle wound. And these two accounts from Old Norse literature are very similar to what we look at in Anglo-Saxon literature about elves. There's an Anglo-Saxon spell in which the elves are explicitly associated with the Asir, that is, the gods. And in fact, this is the only example of the Old English cognate for Asir, which is Isir. The spell is a protective spell against elf shot, because the Anglo-Saxons believed that horses could be injured by invisible arrows from malicious elves. It says, "Ut little spera, if her inner see." That means, out little spear if there is one here within. Later it says, "Ut spera nasin spera, if her inner see isenis dal. Hag tessen je werk, hit shale je multen. If the wara on fell, shotten of the wara on." It basically says, if you were shot in the skin, or were shot in the flesh, or were shot in the blood, or were shot in the limb, may your life never be harmed. If it was the shot of Ise, or it was the shot of Alpha, or it was the shot of Hagtassen, now I will help you. This for you as a remedy for the shot of Isa. This for you as a remedy for the shot of Alpha. Isa means the Asir, the gods, and Alpha means the elves. Now this spell was recorded in the 10th century, hundreds of years after the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity, so perhaps the pagan gods and the elves were now seen as malicious entities, but had formerly We know that the gods weren't always seen that way, so probably the elves weren't either. So what had formerly been great things to be worshipped became suddenly evil and scary, and that's developed over time in folklore. In the Icelandic king sagas, there's an account of one great king who was worshipped after his death and was known as Olafur Gyrstadalfur, which means Olafur, the elf of Gyrstadr. In the legendary sagas of Iceland, elves are referred to along with the ancestors, and the ancestors are often seen as having sexual relations with elf women. Thorstein's saga Vikingsaga recounts a line of local kings who ruled over Alfheimr, and that means the land of the elves. Since they had elven blood, they were allowed to do this, and it made them more beautiful than most men. So what we can see clearly is that it was believed among the Norse that their ancestors, their great ancestors, had elf blood, and that they were conducting ceremonies and sacrifices to these elves, and at least one of these sacrifices was done at a specific point in the year annually and was connected to honouring the gods. Unfortunately, we can't know very much more about that, but it does seem obvious that the elves are associated with the ancestors. And since we know that all other Indo-European traditions seem to have something at this time of the junction between the end of autumn and the beginning of winter, and that this time is seen as a time of the dead, it seems quite likely, in fact, that Alfheimr was held around what we now call Halloween. The tradition of celebrating idealized or deified ancestors solidified ties of kinship and inspired pride and dignity in the people. It was a very Indo-European tradition, with derivative forms among the Hindus called the matrices, among Celts of Gaul and of the Germanic people, known in Latin as the cult of the matronae or matris, clearly also related to the Anglo-Saxon Modrenicht, the Night of the Mothers, and the Slavic Dziady, Night of the Grandfathers. It is in this spirit that Halloween should be celebrated. Whether you happen to be an Irishman celebrating Samhain, a Norse pagan celebrating Alfablot, a Balt celebrating Martini, or a Slav celebrating the Night of the Great Grandfathers, or just an American celebrating Halloween in your own way, I wish you a very happy Halloween, and thank you for watching Survive the Jive.